uh, morning. And we have our guest from France who flew in this morning at 4 o'clock. So, sorry, we had to ask you to come. Uh, I'm Nadeem. I'm currently looking after IRS. And thank you very much for being here. Today, we are going to talk about climate negotiations. Very, very brief comments in the beginning from my side. We at IRS in November started a climate program under the title of Strengthening Regional Climate Resilience. The focus of this program is going to be on climate challenges and regional solutions, ecology and environmental protection, disaster risk management, food security, water security, and energy security, and climate hotspots and outmigration. We are in collaboration with CSCCC, with Aisha Khan, and along with her and her organization, IRS embarked upon a journey of holding a lot of events on climate change. In October, we had a pre-COP event before the start of Sharm el-Sheikh, and we are having an event on climate change, a big event on climate change after COP27, and this is the one. We unfortunately couldn't have a post-COP event on climate change because people were traveling and we couldn't get the people who had attended the COP. But in the words of Aisha, when she wrote, she said that COP27 presented a mixed outcome and breakthrough on loss and damages, but narrowly avoiding backsliding on mitigation and adaptation. This is the line I've taken from her article, which appeared in the Dawn. Well, COP negotiations do provide a forum to the world leaders to discuss climate agenda for effective response of the international world to tackle the effects of climate change. But the main forum, which is the UNFCCC, is the International Treaty on Combating Climate Change, and under it, there are a lot of negotiations which take place around the world. And over the last several decades, governments, civil society, various organizations are coming together to basically grapple and tackle the challenges which the world faces of global warming and climate change. The Paris Accord of 2015 is extremely important, and many countries strengthened their climate commitments at the various COPs after 2015. But despite this intensified diplomacy, despite people coming together, countries coming together, a lot of experts are of the view that the world is facing consequences of climate change, and they are going to become worse. As we all know, today the world faces heat waves, droughts, floods, rising seas, Arctic thaws, and species losses. Our average temperature is rising at an unprecedented rate, and human activity, use of fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas are regarded as the primary drivers of this rapid warming and climate change. Experts also feel that the current pledges which the countries have made at these various COPs, at various other fora, are not enough to save the world and to prevent it from global warming. So we have to adapt. We have to do more to tackle these harmful effects. And experts are also of the view the pledges, if they are not enacted quickly, to limit global temperatures rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius will spell calamity. And many experts feel that the average temperatures could rise by 2.7 degrees by 2100. So what is the way forward? The way forward, I think, is, and what most people agree, is collaboration, cooperation, discussions, negotiations. And no single country can tackle climate change. No region can tackle climate change because the threat is not regional. The threat is not to a country. The threat is to the entire world. And I think the way forward, again, there are many views about it. Some people feel that COP negotiations are a waste of time. Some people feel that COP negotiations are the way forward. Some feel that there should be more regional cooperation, more regional talk on it. But the key is that the international community has to collaborate, it has to negotiate, it has to work with one another to mitigate the harmful effects of climate change. Because if we don't do that, then the future of the world and the future of our generations is going to be at risk. With these brief comments, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for a patient listening. And now the floor is yours, Aisha.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nadeem. Thank you also for co-hosting this event. Before I start my role as the moderator, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Embassy of France for providing us with this opportunity to host Mr. Jordan Vellin over here. And I would like to thank Syed Mujtaba Hussain from the Ministry of Climate Change, who has taken time from his busy schedule to deliver special remarks, and Ambassador Shahid Kamal to give the concluding remarks. As you all know, and as Ambassador Nadeem has said, climate change is a global issue, but it is a problem which is exceedingly complex and difficult to understand for ordinary people. All of you who are present here are sector specialists, so I know that you understand the climate change causes and what needs to be done, but perhaps negotiations is a different ballgame. Very few people actually understand what climate negotiations are all about, what are the nuances, what are the intricacies, what are the issues and challenges that negotiators from 196 countries, when they sit together annually, face. And most of the time, I think the outcome is misunderstood because the expectations are flawed. So in order to address these issues, we all know what causes climate change. We also all know what needs to be done. The issues are who needs to do what, when, and how. And this is essentially what the negotiations are all about. Time is running out, as Ambassador Nadeem said, and 2030 is that critical timeline, the tipping point beyond which a lot of other issues will make climate change more catastrophic than it has been so far. So to start off, I think I will request a round of introductions. I have already introduced the head table, but I would like to begin from this end, and then we will request our speakers.
Good morning and bonjour. My name is Christopher Wenzel. I'm heading the Climate and Energy Partnership that was established between Pakistan and Germany in 2021. And I do that on behalf of GIZ here in Pakistan.
Assalamu alaikum and good morning. This is Ahmed Kamal, presently working as Chief Engineering Advisor and Chairman, Federal Flood Commission, Ministry of Water Resources. Thank you.
Jamali. I work for the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center as climate policy expert. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Asif Khan. I'm the head of office for the German Red Cross, based in here in Islamabad, also covering Afghanistan. The projects that we have is on advocacy and coordination, and also to develop the disaster legislation law with the government of Pakistan. These are the projects funded by the BMZ German ministry. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. I'm Asadullah Salim, and I work for Pakistan Poverty Alleviation Fund.
I'm Rashid Wali Janjua. I'm Director Research, Islamabad Policy Research Institute.
I'm Dr. Fayaz from NEST.
Good morning. I'm Zainab Naeem, and I head program for ecological sustainability and circular economy at Sustainable Development Policy Institute.
Good morning. I am Dr. Viva Sattar and I head the Population Council in Pakistan. And we are trying to do research on the intersections between population and environment and population climate change. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Dylan Chillard. I'm the cooperation attaché at the French Embassy.
Well, thank you. With that, I would now like to request Syed Mujtaba Hussain, Additional Secretary from the Ministry of Climate Change, to please deliver his special remarks.
Thank you, Aisha, and thank you, Ambassador Nadeem Riaz and Ambassador Shahid Kamal and other colleagues from the French Embassy, and all of you who are here for this very important interaction on an issue of utmost importance to Pakistan, given its particular vulnerability, as we all understand that we are in the top 10 list of highly vulnerable countries. With this background, the IRS had, as Ambassador Riaz has already highlighted, there was an event before COP, and I guess this is an event which is happening after COP. So both the events hold actually are very important from the perspective of preparing for climate change negotiations, and then the other important part is the follow-up. So I don't have a written speech. I would keep it more on an interactive level. But this time, the ministry, as you all understand, we were the chair of G77 and China. So Pakistan had a lot of responsibility on its shoulders, being heading a group which is the biggest group in the climate change negotiations, 135 countries in total. So with this background, we actually took the point of view of those countries, in fact, which are highly vulnerable from the impacts of climate change, particularly countries in the South Asian region, in the small island states, in the least developed countries, and the African region. So these are the countries that are impacted, and especially the population of those countries, the communities on the ground who are in fact the first, I would say, the responders to a phenomena which is impacting the whole of the globe. Pakistan, in fact, raised the voice of these countries on an issue of utmost importance, that is loss and damage, which has been in the negotiations for the past more than 25-30 years. So this time around, we actually put this on the agenda of COP27 with a lot of effort. The negotiations went late, early in the morning, when it was in fact included in the agenda. And after that, the responsibility was to in fact establish a facility or a fund for loss and damage. Why we were aiming for this, specifically from the perspective of those countries that are consistently impacted by these climate extreme events. So with this background, throughout the COP, there was a lot of momentum, not only in closed doors, but in the bilaterals and other sidelight events. So I think I'm happy to inform, and probably you know it all also, that with these efforts within closed doors and outside the closed doors, and with a lot of diplomacy, where in fact there were countries in the developed side of the spectrum who actually, a few of them understood the issue and came in the forefront to actually help countries like Pakistan establish this very important fund. You would understand that there are already different funds like the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility. All these funds have a specific structural arrangement, and the arrangement is specifically project oriented. So we formulate projects and then we take these projects, and our projects are in competition with the rest of the projects, not only in the region, but on a global level. And that's where Pakistan faces an issue in terms of its capacity in formulating very transformative or bankable projects. So far, we have not been able to tap the level of financing from these global funds. I would like to inform that so far as the Global Environment Facility is concerned, the star allocation has been hovering around 14 million, and this year it has gone to 17.3 million, an additional 3 million. As far as the GCF is concerned, we have been able to tap in total 135 million. But if we compare this level of funding with countries in the region like Bangladesh and India, I would say that this is too little. And I already said that we have capacity issues in terms of formulating good projects. The Ministry of Climate Change is trying to strengthen its capacity by strengthening a climate finance unit in the ministry, whereby we will have experts who would not handhold different ministries at the federal level, but also will go to the provincial government in terms of developing and designing good projects. In case of the loss and damage funding facility, as already highlighted, that would be a new animal in the room. And the reason that we actually worked a lot for the establishment was the GCF procedures are too cumbersome and too time consuming. First of all is the ability of a country to actually design a good project, and the other challenge that even if the project is submitted, the challenge is that the procedures are too bureaucratic, too time consuming. For a project, it takes an average of like 18 to 24 months to get the final approval and get the project going on the ground. So countries like Pakistan, who are consistently impacted by extreme events, we cannot, have the luxury of waiting for this long. And by the time these projects come on ground, our actually needs have gone beyond that. So with this idea in mind, the delegation actually fought till the end, the early morning after the 2 days extension, whereby the loss and damage fund was announced. And now the other challenge is in terms of defining the procedures and the level of financing that the new fund will have. And that's where our primary challenge is. Our effort would be not to come up with the same kind of procedures that take too long. And in fact, this new funding facility was created with the idea that it should be at speed and scale for countries like Pakistan. So I think, these kind of roundtables will give us here ideas that how do we progress from this point onwards. And we have people from the academia, people from the development partners, different agencies, and also regional institutes whereby we can share inputs and experiences that how do we progress, and COP28 would be a challenge for us from the perspective of coming to a closure on loss and damage. And during the intersessional period, I think it is the right time that we need to have more interaction and more inputs where we can gather ideas, whereby when our negotiators become part of the transitional committee who is supposed to define the contours of the new loss and damage funding facility, we'll be better prepared and better equipped to I would say a top-down structure like the Green Climate Fund. So with these words, thank you, and over to Aisha.
Thank you very much. I will actually pick up a line from where you left, saying preparing for follow-up negotiations and building partnerships, because this is what today's event is all about. The floods 2022 were a wake-up call for us because the losses have highlighted the need for urgency in action. There's always a symbiotic relationship between a country's climate ambitions and its development goals. And that is what Pakistan is aiming to do, to see how can it leverage the capacities and capabilities it has to get the most from climate negotiations. And I will now invite our guest speaker. He arrived this morning from France, and we're very grateful. And it's a privilege, Jordan, to have you with us. Jordan Veland is an expert of the French National Institute of Public Policy. He's a diplomat, teacher at Sciences Po Paris, climate negotiator for France in the United Nations, G7 and G20. Previously, he was a research fellow at the French Institute for High National Defense Studies, member of the cabinet of the President of the French Constitutional Council, drafter of the European Climate and Finance Pact, and Global Pact for the Environment Project. He's also an associate expert on ecological transitions to the French think tank foundation and member of L'Alliance network of civil servants in charge of greening the French administration. So he comes with very rich experience. And given that the whole climate conversation is now embedded in the Paris Agreement of 2021, COP21 that took place in 2015, and the French diplomacy played a great role in ensuring the success of climate negotiations that have been going on from 1995. I now request Jordan to please take the floor and share his thoughts, after which we will go into a Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chief Executive. And I admit I'm very grateful for your invitation. I'm honored to be around this table this morning. I have to say that I'm a little tired. This fact, in addition to the very interesting talk we have today, and the fact that I just landed in a beautiful host country, I actually feel at climate COPs today. So I have this feeling that this conversation can have mutual benefits. I'm coming for the first time in Pakistan, and I'm deeply honored to have the opportunity to participate in that talk today. Madam Aisha Khan, you talked about the COP27 outcomes, and you said it was a mixed one. We have exactly the same vision of that conference, because as my colleague from the Ministry of Climate Change said, the loss and damage found was an excellent one. And it was kind of a landmark moment in climate negotiations. And we all admit that. On the other hand, even if we had the opportunity to, in the final decision of COP27, to keep the 1.5 target within reach in the text, we are numerous to consider this COP as a mixed one that lays the foundation for further progress for COP28 and further negotiations. And as you said, Mr. Ambassador, climate negotiations are also about other forums. I may have 3 points. Maybe the first one will tackle the chances, sorry, we have in the current situation regarding the climate international negotiations. Then as a second point, I would tackle how the current scientific and physical situation leads us to a new climate regime in which we have to reinvent our relations with those issues. And my third point will be about the implementation challenges ahead of us. So the first one, our chances. If we had had that conversation, let's say in the year 2010 or maybe in 2000, we would not have had such a comprehensive, integrated international climate regime that we experience today. It's not only about the Paris Agreement that was adopted in 2015, it's also about the Rio Agreement, the one that laid the foundations of the international climate regime back in 1992. And then we established as an international community, first a definition of climate change that was just encapsulating its human-caused roots. And second, we had objectives, but we were missing targets. And it has taken very long to adopt international common targets in international texts. And that's why the Paris Agreement back in 2015 was such a landmark agreement. I have also to mention the contribution to the Pakistanese diplomacy back in those years in between Pakistani diplomats in we established the Bali roadmap that just out. The Paris Agreement was the mostly adopted agreement in recent history, the most rapidly ratified one. So it tells a lot about the opportunity it was creating back in those times. But at the same time, the objectives, and you said it, Mr. Ambassador, do lack substance, do lack concrete implementation. And that would be my second point. On the ground of the physical consequences, aftermath of climate change, I think we're entitled to say that we entered what can be called the era of consequences of climate change. Maybe it was not that case back in the 80s or the 90s, or maybe the early 2000s, but now you mentioned the floods back in 2022 summer. But the science gets very clear now. We established that target of limited global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels, and to pursue the efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees back in Paris. But now, the IPCC, the famous Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, establishes that we already reached 1.1 degrees Celsius of global warming already. And in that regard, we might never experience in our lives, let's say, a news title saying climate change is over. We might never be able to experience that. We are only kind of suffering the trajectory of the concentration of greenhouse gases emission in the atmosphere, and all our lives long in this room, it might never change because of the lasting character of those gases in the atmosphere. So that's why we entered a new climate regime, both on the environmental or physical side, and both on the international regime side. And that's why we have to consider new realities, such as the planet boundaries, such as this rising effects of climate change. And this is what is ahead of us as long as we are able to tackle this issue. And that leads me to my third point, the implementation challenges. Paris agreements has basically 3 pillars. mitigation of climate change, adaptation to it, and finance. And maybe we can consider that the loss and damage is both into adaptation and finance issues. On the mitigation side, the 1.5 target is still within reach, but according to the science, the window of opportunity is considerably reducing. And that's how keeping 1.5 within reach imply that the big emitters, including the historic emitters, so I'm considering that Europe and the US are among the main historical emitters, need to implement commitments that have been taken within the framework of the Paris Agreement, but domestically it only means basically to reach net zero emissions around mid-century. And this may be one of the most transformative roadmaps we can have into public policies framing. Reaching net zero for every economy on Earth is a change of paradigm, if I may say so. It's a challenge that I do think we never experienced in previous times. And so that's why the Paris Agreement implemented this framework of the nationally determined contributions with the horizon of 2030, also laid a foundation for longer lasting roadmap that I call long-term strategies. And those, particularly for historical emitters and major emitters now, do embody what the international regime can do. But on the mitigation side, I should remind participants around this table that the international provisions cannot substitute national implementation. People tend to think that the international provisions are so strong that can be considered as being enough for climate change to be tackled. And this also applies to a broad range of international issues. But as always, domestic implementation makes it all substantial and effective. So that's why the Paris Agreement is a very effective framework, but it does not constitute an end per se. It's only a framework. And it's kind of an achievement. On the adaptation side, the major idea is to internationally agree on a common understanding of a global goal of adaptation. And this is very hard because from some delegation and parties, it can be considered as a qualitative objective, if I may say so. So you could envisage it as a comprehensive conception of what adaptation means. But from other parties and party groupings, it can also be considered as a quantitative target. So it may be linked with finance issues. And so this is the third pillar of the Paris Agreement, financial issues. Mr. Syed Hussein, you said that the global framework about international finance regarding climate change does not deliver sufficient results. Back in 2009, the Copenhagen COP did establish a target, the famous $1 billion pledge. And the idea of it is that the developed countries, the so-called advanced economies, were responsible of delivering this amount of finance every year from that basis, from 2020 to approximately 2025. And the most recent reports did establish that these targets of the 1 billion pledge would be only implemented or reached this year in 2023. So it tells a lot about the difficulties of implementation of every international target and the challenge ahead of us is how we can build a more effective finance architecture.
And if I may take my French diplomat cap for a few seconds. Maybe you know that next June in Paris, we will organize a summit that may be called the New Financial Pact, a summit about restructuring the finance architecture on development finance, including climate finance. And the aim of this summit is first to raise attention about the financial issues, to gain more commitments, to shed lights on the insufficiencies of the, especially climate finance tracks. Second, it will still aim to establish new commitments, new roadmaps, new frameworks regarding the IMF, the World Bank's activities regarding climate change, with a broad range of package of series of ideas that are under consideration. And to finish, the third objective would be to be more able to incentivize the private sector to commit itself in the international climate finance tracks. Of course, the private sector has also a role to play regarding those financial pledges. So I may finish my point by saying that all things considered, we are kind of experiencing something that I call the emerging tradition of climate change diplomacy. We know it's going to be a tradition given the time of the evolution of the climate change. And it's also emerging because we are only not so rapidly laying the foundations and the pillars of it. And we might be able to make progress regarding implementation. And that's why international cooperation is so important now. To echo your last point, COP28 will aim to reinforce this implementation side, but also, I hope so, make us provide new commitments and new capabilities regarding international climate diplomacy, setting new standards, including on mitigation side. And we may be able to talk about that later, but our European perspective is that we need to tackle the issue of fossil fuels phase out, which might be 30 years after the adoption of the Rio Convention, the most symbolic outcome we could hope for, because fossil fuels have never been tackled, namely in international climate texts. And that's why we have that kind of challenges ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jokta. I think that was very, very enlightening. You talked about the 3 pillars. You talked about the current climate scenarios, how to reinvent the climate regime, and of course, the challenge of implementation. You also talked about diplomacy, development, and finance, and I'm sure our participants will be very eager and keen to ask you questions around the question of finance and the new collective quantified goals that will be set up. It's very interesting to know that France is planning to host this summit in June, and I think people in Pakistan, civil society, and of course the government would be very interested to see what new scenarios and approaches you're going to suggest to deal with the current problems. With that, I open the floor for questions to Jokta and for people to make their comments and interventions. Please introduce yourself and keep the questions brief so that we can have really a robust and interactive dialogue. Thank you.
But my question is, as you mentioned, as mentioned by the Sayyid Mujtaba Sahab, that there are 2 different kinds of funding like JEF and GCF funding. So I think most of the universities in Pakistan, they are not eligible to apply for these funding. What will be the, so through accredited bodies, we can only apply for these funding. So what will be the procedure and how we can get funding and how we can access these funds so that we can apply for the relevant projects? Thank you.
I think I would first request Syed Mujtaba Hussain to respond to that question, and then Jordan, you can pick it up.
So thank you very much for this very pertinent question. And there's a criteria of applying for both the funds, and for the GCF, the criteria is an organization, whether it's an academic organization or a government or a private sector entity, they have to be accredited first. So you need to come up with the details about your organization, how many projects, climate change or mitigation or adaptation related projects that your university or organization has undertaken. You need to identify your fiduciary and legal formalities about the organization. So there is a whole plethora of criteria which is laid down for getting yourself accredited with the GCF. And once you acquire that accreditation process, then you will become a national entity which can directly access the GCF. So first criteria would be your accreditation, and then you can formulate a project proposal, again, based on the criteria, a very detailed criteria outlined by the GCF. And we also have GCF Board Pakistan, which actually scrutinizes all the project proposals and then approves those project proposals which have met the criteria. And then the GCF had its own scrutiny due diligence process, which is quite cumbersome and which again is laid out. I can send you a link where you can see the requirements, and then once you meet their criteria, and then your project gets approved by the GCF Global Board. Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Jordan, would you like to add to that, please?
I have nothing much more to add, but only maybe mentioning that GCF and the CHEF might not be the only funding arrangements in which you might be interested in. We have actually, I recently just checked the broad financial ecosystem, if I may say so, at the international level, and all the possibilities that are offered to actors. Of course, the financial pledges are not as a whole efficient, but when you look at mapping of existing funds and opportunities, they are so numerous that I could not quote them. So I've nothing much more to recommend. But this idea that maybe bilateral facilities, regional ones, thematic ones, for instance, I know that the adaptation fund under the UNFCCC has been again founded at the level of $351 million this year, and it is only an instance of what can be done. I should also mention that the private funds that could also participate in those efforts and the funding projects. So I may only encourage you to consider these broad range of options, and including with national agencies, including with all that kind of facilities too.
Christopher, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And first of all, let me apologize that I have to run in a few minutes, and it's not related to the answer to my question. I can assure you that. My name is Christopher, as I said, working for GIZ, but please take it as a personal comment, remark, question. I'm very grateful for you that you said climate change will not go away. And I might add to that, you can't buy yourself out of this situation. I say that because this is, again, my personal opinion. When it comes to the evaluation of COP results, I sometimes, or most cases, I have the impression like there are some delegations that say, oh, I gave enough this time. And the others might say, I got enough this time. But as we say, it does not go away. We are all sitting in the same boat. Isn't it about like a one time in a year giving and obtaining, but about what Secretary Mujtaba said, to come to a regime where we understand that we have to cooperate and to help each other on a permanent basis. And therefore, maybe sometimes speed might be of more importance than the scale. What do X billions help if you can't access the funds? So this quantitative view of it that prevails sometimes, I think. Do you see, I'm not a COP expert, I didn't follow it for the past 10, 15 years, but do you see that there is a kind of change in mindset in regarding this happening, or is it still like, okay, this time we were successful, we're looking forward to the next time, and in the meantime, yeah, we see what's happening?
Thank you, Christopher, for this very important question. And let me align my comment with the perception that you have. Like first is the negotiations on a global level, and which results in entities like the GCF, JEFs, and Special Climate Change Fund, LDCF. There's a number of them which are available, but these are all global funds. And then there is cooperation on a bilateral level, where any kind of assistance coming from our bilateral and multilateral partners is also climate finance. And we forget here one very important aspect, that any kind of funding which is coming through whichever window, whether it's bilateral, multilateral, or the global funding options, in fact caters to supporting communities at the grassroots level. And for a country like Pakistan, it is very important that we channelize all our resources, all our efforts in that direction, trying to mobilize financing, what we called, the definition is still not there. It is in the UNFCCC process. The whole ambiguity comes around coming with a common definition of climate finance. But we all understand, sitting in our own spheres, that any kind of assistance which is coming for adaptation or mitigation purposes per se is climate finance. So as you already highlighted, the bilateral and other channels are equally important. And for us, a country like Pakistan, it is very important that we kind of strengthen that kind of interaction on a bilateral level. I can give an example of Global Shield, which with the German side has actually steered, and it's particularly for vulnerable countries who are impacted by climate extreme events, to build their resilience and to reduce their risks, and also to come up with some kind of a insurance mechanism. So similar ideas and similar kind of interactions on a bilateral level also holds a lot of importance for vulnerable countries like Pakistan.
Thank you very much for organizing this discourse. Basically, this provides definitely a platform where we can interact, we can learn from each other, and certain ideas can pop up, which can be picked up by concerned authorities, and those can be developed. I would like to, before posing a question, I would like to first establish the context. I am, as I've introduced myself, I am Dr. Fayaz from NIST. I am working on climate change for the last 10 years, and I'm working on disaster management as well. And I'm being a civil engineer related to development as well. So these three aspects I am presently working at. Now, if we see climate change, it's a reality. It has certain reasons behind this, and we should see the impacts, what impacts climate change would have on us. And those impacts, what are the reasons of those impacts, are the causes of climate change? We would go for the mitigation as far as those reasons are concerned. But as far as those impacts are concerned, we really would have to think about the development part, and we would have to think about the management part. Without establishing a matrix, we will not be able to understand the application of this very subject in its true perspective. Now, I would just build it on. For example, if we just see the impact, we would have impact on water, have impact on agriculture, we have impact on energy, we have impact on environment, we have impact on coastal areas, we have even impact on health. So that is how we should be seeing the impact part of it. Now, the consequences, what consequences would these impacts have? We would have water insecurity, uncertainty, unpredictability of the weather systems. Then we have food insecurity. Then we have energy insecurity. Then we have health insecurity. Then we have definitely we'll be living in a polluted environment where we will not be able to breathe properly. Now, I take you back to those three protocols which are governing these three factors which I am trying to identify: the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the SDGs. Now, all these three factors of 2015 protocols having a life of 15 years till to 2030, to my understanding, till the time we would integrate all these three protocols together, we will not be able to find a sustainable solution. Climate resilience, disaster resilience, and sustainable development. These three components, we would have to first think at national level to have that national resilience. Without having integration of these three components, we will not be able to really save ourselves from the damages and losses which climate change is going to impose on us. Just see what happened in floods 2022. 33 million people got impacted. We suffered $15 billion damages, $16 billion losses. Total, we stand at 32 billion need, which we are now looking as a loan for managing that need. Now, how has this happened? How this loss and damage happened? Due to wrong development. Our development is not sustainable. That has been washed away. And due to our weak and reactive management system. We were not proactive in warding off the impact of climate change on our people when we had known that there is a monsoonal shift taking place in our country, and we were not ready. We didn't take cognizance of that very fact. We knew that the monsoon has shifted by 150 kilometers from its origin to the center of the country, and it would have a different area impacted. Now, how should we go about it? Piecemeal discussions, solutions are not really solace, I would call the refuge for us. We have to have a very comprehensive, wholesome discussions which should involve all the stakeholders. To me, without stakeholders like the development stakeholders, the disaster management stakeholders, this discussion cannot be complete as far as climate change is concerned, because who has to manage that climate change impacts? So that is something I'm not really posing a question. I am just trying to share my insight, which I have of this as a subject. I've been leading National Institute of Disaster Management, and I've been building capacity across the country and even across the region. And I know all those countries who have been able to ward off the losses and damages. Those are the only countries which have integrated these three very protocols. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fayaz. Although you have not asked a question, but in your comments, there are two questions that are packed in, and I will direct one to Syed Mujtaba Hussain, and that is about taking a whole of society approach in planning for climate change, and the other one to you, Yorda, in which perhaps Dr. Fayaz is referring towards the need for climate justice.
Dr. Fayasab, I think you have hit the whole crux of the issue. It is all relating to our proactive planning. We, as a government functionary, or as a, if I may call myself as a development practitioner as well. So I would say that your comments are very pertinent. We have not factored in building disaster risk resilience in whatever development that we are undertaking. And in fact, the government now has taken a little effort in that direction by coming up with a 4RF framework: reconstruction, rehabilitation, recovery, and resilience framework. With the idea in mind that whatever reconstruction that is going to take place in the aftermath of 2022 floods has to build that element of resilience in place if we have to ward off this level of damage from any future climate extreme event. So it's a bit late, but I think it's the step in the right direction. And with this intent in mind, we also have to make sure that any level of development that is going to take place in a business as usual scenario in the Planning Commission of Pakistan has to factor in climate resilience in any project. That as a policy decision, the government has to take, and probably the Ministry of Climate Change will take a lead in that direction. Because if we have to look at infrastructure, a bridge, a building, a road, which is going to be built in future, or which is already there but has been damaged or washed away because of similar climate extreme events. So any kind of rehabilitation or new construction in future which is going to take place has to factor in that kind of resilience. But mind you, for that, the funding required would be definitely not the one that has been a part of the 4RF framework. Just to give you a rule of thumb, if we have to build in climate resilience in any project, if we have to spend $1 in a business as usual scenario, so we may have to spend $4 if we have to build in climate resilience or factor in climate resilience in that developmental activity. It is that kind of funding which is required. But I mean, that's very crucial. That's very important for a country if we have to survive all these extreme events in future, given our vulnerability situation, which is, by the way, not has been highlighted by us. This is on a global level, an organization by the name of German Watch, which comes up with the risk assessment on a country level. So I think this is very important, but this is how. Thank you.
Like to just add one sentence that if it is $1 for climate sort of management and $4 for climate resilience, it is $10 for climate impacts management. That is so expensive. What we're spending now, if we would not spend that $1 at appropriate time, we would have to spend $10 managing its impacts. Sir.
Thank you, Dr. Fayez, for your crucial remarks. I would first echo them as a contextual remarks and then tackle what we can do with regard of what you said. As for the context, I may quote a recent report by the European Risk Committee. They released a report 3 years ago saying, too much belated, too much sudden. Maybe I should speak louder, but you being closer may be easier. So this report was intitulated, sorry, too much belated, too much sudden. This is the kind of shift we have to consider. And I so need to say that on the European perspective, institutions, including local ones, ground situation, if I may say so, are not ready to tackle the consequences of climate change, neither. There is a global lack of adaptation, understanding, and capacities all over the world. And the main challenges are, in my perspective, what climate change is breeding is the accelerated obsolescence of capital. It makes the global shift to net zero and to climate resilience all the more difficult. And second, maybe we should have tackled this before, the limits to adaptation, which is the concept that the IPCC just created in February 2022 report, saying that if we go beyond 1.5, some adaptation solutions will not be efficient anymore. And same over 2 degrees. And so that's why the window of opportunity also needs to be considered under the mitigation side of action. So as for the climate justice and what needs to be done in that regard, I would say first that we need to stop this infernal machinery, which consists of basically burning fossil fuels and emitting more GHG in the atmosphere. It might sound kind of a dream or something not concrete, but it has so concrete aspects, and obviously in priority in big emitters economies. Second, funding regarding the fair share about climate finance, but also regarding, I said it before, the involvement of private sector and capacity building on the ground. That only means that some local actors need to be trained, need to understood at the local level what they can do, how they can respond to the local challenges and build resilience. And I want to tackle the situation, specific one of the early warning systems. Maybe you know that this year, the United Nations Secretary General fixed the targets saying no individual on Earth should live without early warning system, because this phenomenon, of course, impacts more strongly vulnerable communities, but it has consequences all around the world in every region of the world. And regarding to that, it's, as I said, a stake of formation of education, a stake of a means of observation. I mean, every time a flood is coming, every time a heat wave is coming, we need to build capacities to warn population that it's coming. Second, there is some local management issues, and sometimes people say that cities have a specific role to play in that regard. For instance, the waste management could have massive impacts on reducing the impacts of flood. Or I may also mention one last point, the fact that under the framework of the Paris Agreement, so a broad international kind of vague agreement, parties are not required, but encouraged to build long-term strategies. And this has a massive impact, not the one you could imagine saying like, let's fix a target like at 2050 or 2060 or in the second part of the century. But recent research just established that by fixing a long-term goal, it can bring actors at all levels of governance, including the federal one, the provincial ones. And this framing of long-term strategies had massive impacts on how governance could be efficient in a way. So I may not be able to tell much more, but thank you for your remarks.
Thank you for that. I think we'll go with Dr. Imran Khalid, and after that, I'd like to request Mr. Ahmed Kamal, because floods and hydrometeorological disasters is the new reality that we're going to have to live with, and we'll continue the conversation, and I will reach out to the rest. Imran Khalid.
Thank you so much. My name is Imran Khalid. I work with WWF Pakistan. Appreciate the discussion here today. I really appreciated the fact that you've highlighted the need to mitigate and stop the emissions, because this is what I'd written. It's a moving goalpost, right? You cannot adapt to a moving goalpost when you do not know what the target is. Is it 1.5? Is it 2 degrees? Is it 2.6 as the current commitments show? How do you even begin to adapt to that? So this whole, and Secretary Saab has left, but the question then is, the R4F and the Geneva funding that, that they've been calling for the loans, how will that account for this changing goalpost? And this is something that the developing countries really need to pick up on and call out the global north on. At this time, as the war in Europe was Ukraine wages on, countries that had previously gone on to say that we're going to invest in renewables are now reverting to fossil fuels because of this. So this is not only about climate change, but also about conflict resolution and international governance as a whole, right? Because it all feeds into that. So caught in the thick of things are Pakistanis, caught in the thick of things are Bangladeshis, people in Maldives, where they do not have a voice. So if they do not ever have a voice here in Islamabad, right? So because of how decisions are made. So it's very important that we account for them. And I appreciated the fact that when you talked about climate justice, you highlighted the need to mitigate. I do have a question, and that's a couple of questions, in fact. Once in regard to climate financing, we've talked about climate finance, but yes, there are facilities available, there's GCF, GEF, but up till now, the climate finance that has been made available, most of it is going towards mitigation and not adaptation, number one. Secondly, most of it is in the form of soft loans and not as grants as it should be, given the fact that it's the developing countries that are most impacted. And finally, this process for accessing that finance, that's quite arduous. It's not easy for any entity, number one, to get accredited. And once they are accredited, to go through that whole process, and it can take years. Right. So we at WWF Pakistan have been working towards a program called Recharge Pakistan. It's addressing some of the floods that have happened. It started after the 2010 floods, and it's taken about 12 years for the process to come full circle. We've had to rely on our partners in the US, WWF US, which was the accredited agency, and work with them. We've been working with the Ministry of Climate Change, Ministry of Water Resources. And it's been a prolonged process. Given the fact that disasters as a result of climate change are striking at a regular pace, do you really think that this process is viable? Because as we're going to see more and more of such events happening across the world, people would like to access funding. But if the process is, I think it's a broken system. If it's not easily accessible, then it's a broken system. Then how do we fix it? That's one. Secondly, what's your take on net zero versus actual zero? We've been talking about carbon offsets, but there's double counting involved in that. When we talk of net zero, what we are saying is, look, yeah, we'll do this. We'll go beyond the requirements to mitigate, but then we'll, plant enough trees to bring it back down. Now, this is theoretical. There is no basis in that, and there is enough scientific evidence to state that, look, if there is a problem, you mend it right away. If there's water coming through the window, instead of saying, look, I'll have the cleaners come in and clean up the hall later on, fix the window and stop the water from coming in. And this net zero versus actual zero is a major concern for me. So I'd like to have your thoughts on this as well. So thank you very much.
That was a series of loaded questions, Imran, and I'm sure Jordan will take some time. Meanwhile, I just wanted to say that there is a running tea. So anybody who wishes to help themselves, please feel free to do that. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention. While you were speaking, came to my mind a sentence by an American scientist called Michael Eman about climate mitigation. He's one of the leading scientists that had to fight against what he calls powers of misinformation back in the early 2000s in the US, when climate change was not considered as being real. And he said, every ton of carbon that is not emitted makes the world better. And I love this idea. And when you were talking about the shifting goals on mitigation, actually, we might reach 1.5 quite soon. According to the IPCC, it might be in the early 2030s, it might be even sooner. And still we're working on that 1.5 target. It only means that aligning targets to an objective, even unrealistic, can bear results. And actually, when we will have crossed 1.5, we'll have a broad fight not to reach 1.6. And same for 1.7. So, as introductory first remarks, I needed to say that. Regarding finance, you highlighted the discrepancies or the gaps between first mitigation and adaptation. As far as I know, the rate is quite impressive. It's something like 75% for mitigation and the rest for the adaptation. Yeah, it is not suitable to the situation, but as I said before, limits to adaptation kind of force us to be very strong of mitigation, financing and mitigation action in the end, so that adaptation doesn't get even harder or impossible in the end. But yeah, it is at the broad level, and I do agree that at the local level, and especially in some vulnerable contexts, of course, it's all about adaptation and the financing of loss and damages in a way. Regarding the discrepancy between loans and grants, I need to echo some financial colleagues that do explain it in a way that kind of convinced me, because of course, when you look at a situation and you consider the different options, of course, a grant seems to be more efficient, more direct, and all the more legitimate that the money can be fresh, if I may say so, and used as soon as it's delivered. But the idea behind the loan idea is all about the concessional loans, saying that if you put a loan with a very low rate under the market conditions, you're able to have a conditionality with results on the ground. And the idea behind is not to make money, because actually, as far as I know, the French Development Agency and the French Treasury don't make any money on climate loans. They just provide this conditionality to make sure that the money goes in the end into the projects that are presented, accepted, and monitored. And if I just may add some contextual views about what the public expects for international finance is the money to go really into the projects and not being in the wrong direction. So there is very scrutiny of the general public about the use of funds. And I think this might be the reasoning behind this historic preference for those loans with conditionalities, as far as I know. And regarding access to finance, of course, I hope this will be one of the issues tackled at the Paris Summit next June, how to make the finance accessible directly, locally, from the multilateral development banks, from the private sector. I'm stressing the involvement of private sector, but this is key. We talked about the fair share of the developed countries regarding climate finance objectives, but some leading emitting companies have a role to play too. And imagine, for instance, I'm just talking about the French context, but France, including loans, is the second largest climate finance provider, with $6 billion per year, including $2 billion regarding adaptation. And just for a matter of comparison, the United States of America just committed into delivering $11 billion from 2020 to 2024. Regarding the capacities and the volume of GDP, that's a broad discrepancy, I may say so. But the access of finance, it's also conditioned to the participation with a conception of the fair share. Regarding the vague net zero commitments, that is true. Some, I should not say some parties, but some actors did set some crazy net zero commitments. Will be net zero by 2035. I heard from the Nespresso coffee company, or some oil companies setting net zero targets by 2040. But it's absurd. It's all relying on the compensation schemes that are hypothetical. And it's pretty much the same at the level of parties to the Paris Agreement. There is no accountability behind net zero targets. This is also why this kind of agreements can be adopted so widely, because there is no accountability mechanism, but it is either a chance, either a drawback. But the fact there is no accountability at the international level doesn't prevent the national level to install some conditionality and accountability. At the EU level and more broadly at the G7 level, I may, for instance, say that 6 members of the G7 out of 7 did fix legally binding net zero commitments. That only means that national tribunals are entitled to look at the trajectory of the national emissions and decide and provide sanctions if the trajectory is not met. And this has been the case recently in Germany, France, also it's not G7, but in Mexico. So this accountability level also relies on the domestic rule of law and how access to justice is provided to. That is another part of the debate. I wanted to say that.
Much. Mr. Ahmed Kamal, as the Federal Flood Commissioner, do you think that disasters and their intensity and frequency is outpacing negotiations? What will that mean for Pakistan? And what would be your question to Jordan?
Thank you very much, ma'am. I think that the only answer that I should give is that we ourselves should make all effort to get this loss and damage fund, get into a reality. Mustafa Saab talked about the COP28, that it will really be a challenge that how on that COP, the loss and damage facility comes to a certain deciding issue on ground. So unless until such sort of a facility is made available, or we ourselves at least at the level of government of Pakistan or at the level of Ministry of Climate Change make effort or take a certain lead towards that, the situation on ground is very clear to every one of us. We made a 4RF document. It has a $16.3 billion for rehab and reconstruction and recovery, and the rest for the long-term projects, including the National Flood Protection Plan 4 and many others. So probably we are not even getting the funds for 16.3 billion requirement with regard to rehab and reconstruction. So we are talking about beyond that. So what sort of an effort we as a nation or we as a government were required to make so that we can show and we can take that and showcase, in front of the rest of the globe that look, last year we were the victim for at a global scale. So next time maybe it is Pakistan again, and what would be the situation? So I should say nobody else, but we should be making all efforts. And I will request Mustafa Saab that since you are representing and you are sitting at the place in Ministry of Climate Change, I think that some serious sort of a homework is required from the government of Pakistan, from the Ministry of Climate Change, so that we can at least make some sort of an impact. It is really very good that the Pakistan delegation in 2027 COP, they had worked a lot with regard to loss and damage, and they have got that thing on ground. So why should not all those relevant organizations, departments, whether federal, provincial, or private, they join hands together and make some sort of a effort towards that, take that to the next COP 2028, and then get that thing done there, because it is for our good. Unless and until we make this effort, I doubt very much. The situation ground is not that good. So that's what I have to say. And another thing is the 2022 floods after 2010 floods brought so much of a big chunk of water on ground. There was nothing on ground to store that water. While we have some sort of a national issues with regard to creating a provincial harmony or national harmony towards building more reservoirs and all that, the Ministry of Water Resources is working on a national strategy for water conservation. So all those efforts are required to be dovetailed or required to be brought in into a single fund, at a single platform. Level, and those are taken, or they're stopped taking, they should be taken with regard to the progress and all that. This is direly needed. This year again, I don't know exactly, but 55 or 54 million acre feet of water that has gone down the drain. And we have totally deferred, maintained our infrastructure with regard to drainage and all that. So these all issues are going to come again and again. And we are talking about the climate change. Look, this year, we are feeling much more, cold. Probably we are getting older, or otherwise it is the reality on ground. So the things are moving like that. So the real sense is what practical steps we are going to take, what practical steps we are going to suggest, and then we can take those project steps, at the maybe regional or the global arena, to get ourselves addressed at their place. Thank you.
Yohta, as you can, hear, and we can all feel that loss and damage is a very big issue for Pakistan. So it was a great achievement at the last COP to get it recognized as a separate finance facility. What we'd like to know from you is, what is the status of the transition committee that was going to be formed? It's very important that Pakistan is part of this committee as a frontline country that is disproportionately facing the impact of climate change. Please tell us a little bit more on, because a whole agenda of taking this loss and damage forward will depend on being a part of this committee.
Thank you for your remarks and for your question. Regarding the loss and damage committee, I'm not exactly aware of the process by now. I know that 10 personalities will be named to compose this committee, but I'm not sure what the process is. But the COP27 decision was also about founding arrangements, plural, founding arrangements. And this is where we wanted to stress that it's not only about one fund, which will need to be as consistent as required, but we need to consider also broad, what we call a mosaic of solutions, which is not about only funding, also about mechanism of early warning systems, as we've been talking about before, and also how to develop a common conception of what are losses, what are damages. That's very important. There is the Santiago network that is aiming for that under the UNFCCC context. Unfortunately, I have not much more to say except a question. I'm very curious about the Pakistani reception consideration about the Geneva summit a few weeks ago. Is that considered to be sufficient, interesting, a landmark contribution, or something upsetting? I'm really curious about your consideration of this summit.
I think that question goes to you, Mustafa. And I think earlier when you just stepped out of the room, Dr. Imran Khalid had also raised concerns about the 4 Rs and how realistically they will be implemented. So I think we will combine the two and give you the floor.
I think this is a very, very difficult question, which has been, targeted towards me. I mean, I'm sure these are Chatham House rules. I mean, I'll be speaking, taking off my bureaucratic hat and maybe talk about as a climate change, expert, you may call it. But, these were some of our concerns when this 4RF document was being formulated. That if you have to build in the climate resilience part in it, then obviously the requirement will go much beyond 16.3 billion or whatever. Because first is the damage part and then there's the reconstruction part. As I said, a very layman, what you call it, rule of thumb, as I already said, that if you have to invest $1 on a business as usual scenario, in a normal case, but if you have to make that structure climate resilient, so you need to invest $4. You have to build in the resilience part in it. So it is that level of financing which is required. So if I look at the success of the conference from that perspective, in my personal opinion, it was not a success. Because as already highlighted, many of the commitments were normal commitments which you would see in a country operation business plan of Asian Development Bank or a country partnership strategy of the World Bank. So that is a normal thing. I mean, we have long-term 3 years or 5-year business plans with the multilaterals, and we do have a partnership strategy with the bilaterals as well. So if you have to reflect that business as usual funding, which in any way would come to Pakistan in a normal situation, then I would say that, this was not something new and additional. This was a normal thing which would, in the next 3 years or 5 years, the country would have. But the important thing, what is there is the concessionality. So that is something which is because, after the 2022 floods, many of the multilaterals as well as bilaterals had actually revisited and built in the concessional element into it. So that's where, I would see some success. That obviously, if a loan has to come with an interest rate of like 4 or 5%, so that loan has come down to 2% or maybe less than 2%. So the success element in a personal context, I would categorize it as a success. But in terms of the quantum, I mean, that was, to my understanding, the grant element was somewhere around like maybe 500,000 to, oh, sorry, was, I guess, little over, I'm not sure about it, but, it was not the way that we were, overseeing that. I have to revisit and check with the Economic Affairs Division, but somehow the figure that is being quoted like 10 billion or 11 billion is something, the greater part of it was something which was already the country had, in fact, in a country partnership strategy or a business plan with the bilaterals and multilaterals. And as far as the 4RF document is concerned, certainly it was, as I already said, it's something which is a first step in the right direction. At least the government recognized that if you have to build in the resilience part, even if it's a flood resilience, I would call it as a flood resilience element. But if I have to take it to the next notch, what is called the climate resilience, then, obviously the level of financing would be much more as compared to the 16.3 billion. So this would be my off-the-cuff response to you.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, sir, what we were discussing was how the goalposts are changing. So the temperatures are rising. We're at 1.5. We're expected to cross 2. So when the government is making these plans, do you have a figure in mind in terms of, it should be 1.8C that we're looking at, or 2C, and when the greenhouse gas emissions keep growing, how does a government like Pakistan's resolve that issue?
So it is not, the question for government of Pakistan. It is a question for the whole community who is a part of the climate change negotiation, and this is what we call the new collective quantified goal, as far as the climate finance is concerned. So that's where actual discussions. I mean, actually climate finance is something which is the most crucial part of climate change negotiations. I have been a part of a few COPs. You see, it is the most difficult thing, because if you don't agree on a common definition of a climate finance, to me, a country like Pakistan, climate finance can be one definition. And to my colleagues on the other side of the fence, it can be something other. So unless and until we reach some common understanding that what actually constitutes climate finance, I think the whole question of taking the ball and throwing it to the next goalpost would carry on. And that's where we don't have a, I would say, not much progress as far as coming to a common conclusion. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Then I'll come back to you, but for the sake of continuity, we're talking about finance, and I want to hear from the Asian Development Bank, especially, two elements that I'd like you to weave into your response. The upgradation of the National Flood Protection Plan 4 and the role the ADB played in setting up the National Disaster Risk Management Fund, how successful that has been, what are the pots of money that are going towards disaster risk resilience and flood protection. Thank you.
I am from Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, not the ADB, ADPC.
Sorry.
But
okay,
I'll come to the finance part.
Okay, but you may be able to still
Yes.
respond to those questions.
Thank you. I'll continue with the Mustafa Saab's comment, and I quite agree what the comment that you made. In terms of, there was talk about climate justice. And in terms of that, we have so many, funding avenues available. But the fundamental question that everybody raised here is the definition of climate finance. And I did that in my PhD research as well, that when you relabel, I call it relabeling of actual development funding into the climate funding, and that was in the beginning. So it was very challenging to distinguish between the development part of the funding and adaptation part of the funding. So that question still begs an answer, because there is no clear definition in terms of what goes into the development obligations, what goes into the climate obligations. One is kind of a charity part, one is the justice part. So that should be very clearly defined. And the second one, I think it flows into the national context that I would also comment, and I quite agree with Mustafa Saab's comment on that. We have this Green Climate Fund, and we have not been able to tap it as much as we could have. I think there are two sides of that. One is it's cumbersome. I agree with you on that. And we are working on accreditation of many other agencies with MOCC, with Ministry of Climate Change and Ministry of Planning. And in terms of that, even if we have a loss and damage fund, we won't be able to tap it. So that's my concern as well, again, because it's not only about the funding availability, it's about your ability, our ability to tap it. So our capacity is not that much, as you rightly mentioned, in terms of accessing those funds. You gave the example of Bangladesh and India and other neighboring countries at our level, and they have tapped it more than others. So I think it's also about our capacities, and I will come to that 4R comment that you said. So I've been working with Planning Commission on integrating climate change into their systems. So even as of today, there's nothing in the project design that says this project is climate resilience. So there is an EIA and other some kind of environmental assessments and DRR checklists, but there's nothing that actually mainstreams climate part into the project planning, because we have that policy, which is great. We have those NDCs, we have those adaptation plans, but when it comes to actual implementation, there is two people sitting in Planning Commission who see the projects as whether they are climate resilient or not. So you rightly said that the climate part is missing, and I'm very worried actually. Even if the funding comes, the actual implementation on the ground will be missing the climate part. So I think we have to put our house in order as well. There is the climate funding part that is there. There are problems accessing, is cumbersome. But then we also have our part that we have to do here is mainstream climate change into the development planning. We have been talking about it in the policy for like 10 years, but we have not been able to do it actually on the ground. So I think, and then when we look at the climate expenditure, we don't know how much we are spending on climate change. There was one report on climate expenditure reviews. So when you go to the world and say that we need 16 billion, then the next question comes, how much have you spent from your own kitty? So we don't do the accounting of climate change, because it's not there's no climate budget tagging in our system. So these things are there. Climate justice part is there. I will like you to comment on that, the relabeling of the climate funding, but also the mainstreaming part, what we can do about it. Thank you.
Okay, so from what I understand from you is that, there's lack of coherence and coordination between line ministries, and that itself will hinder our progress in climate negotiation. Jordan, do you want to comment or respond to that? And then we'll go to you, Zainab.
Actually, one more time, it's more a question than a comment. Could you please elaborate what you said about the fact that the climate part of the funding is missed?
When there was this, in the beginning, when there were this adaptation funding part was being negotiated or told about, so there is this 100 billion that we have for climate funding, and there are other bilateral and development funding part. So one is, the obligation, which is climate justice part. I call it an, obligation as a part. The other one is, development assistance, which is a kind of a charity, you would say. It's not an obligation for the developed world to, they have committed 0.7 of their GDP to, to be as funding for development. But most of the times, and many times, as Mr. Basa rightly said, in the Geneva conference, we went for the funding as flood resilience and as a climate justice, but we got loans. So there, what I'm saying that how it's very challenging, but how can we distinguish this, and what could be done about it that we can clearly say this is development funding, this is climate funding. So that part is still very challenging.
I'll ask Zainab, she's been waiting patiently, and then we'll, go to the next participant and combine a few questions and come back to you.
Thank you so much. I'm representing STPI as Associate Research Fellow. The climate project sizes, they're getting smaller, although the finance providers, they're increasing day by day. And I wanted to ask you regarding how can we measure or track the impact that is being created by the climate finance? We know there's adaptation fund, we know there's GCF, there's GEF, but what impact it is creating, how can we measure that impact? Specifically, the facilities, they are providing the finance to us. We know it's under adaptation, we know it's under mitigation or maybe resilience, but what impact it's creating, we are not able to measure that. And we are not able to report that. Secondly, European climate diplomacy model that was launched after COP26. I would like to know your opinion on that, and how can we replicate that model within South Asia, even if it's feasible or possible? Because we know that the victory that we got at COP27 in the context of loss and damage fund, that was because of good diplomacy. Blame game is not going to work here. We cannot keep on blaming global north, and that bargain is not going to be mended. There's always going to be some resistance in one way or the other. So how can we to target the perma crisis that has been created by climate change? How can we address it through multi-track or crisis diplomacy, if I say so? And if that model can be replicated, if it's possible here in South Asia, so that in next COP, if we are taking our case not as only G77, but also as a regional leader and, integrating all players. So if you can please comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take one more question, and then Jordan, you can respond to both.
Yeah, Steph Jamali from Jinnah Institute. So obviously the loss and damage fund is a win, but referring back to what the gentleman on my left said, the modalities matter, and the diplomacy around the modalities and the procedures would matter. So when we look at the GCF, Bangladesh is the support that it's received is thrice what Pakistan has. Pakistan has not been able to, even though we are higher up on the vulnerability index, we're not able to rave that in. So what lessons, or what does this intersessional period of diplomacy have to look like for us to be better able to get the support from these funds that we require? Because if they're not catering to countries like Pakistan, which is higher on the vulnerable profile, then from Pakistan's perspective, from from diplomacy perspective, that is still a failing that we need to then work around. So just to get a better sense of that. Another point I wanted to bring in was the adaptation fund. One of the goals for this COP was to double the funding for it. That failed. And now at the same time, the pledges are till 2025. So just to understand the implications that would have, the fact that this is not being prolonged, and it's also that it's not been, the funding has not been expanded upon. Thank you.
Will Pakistan be getting into disaster capitalism trap?
Okay, Jordan, I think you have three important queries to respond to.
Thank you for all those questions. On your point, sir, about development climate finance. As far as I'm concerned, there is on my national side a broad interrogation and new perspective on the table saying, is climate finance part of the development agenda? And should we consider, or should we consider climate finance as a real specialized, separate for development funding, and so being in a way detached for SDGs? I'm sure the answer is not here yet, but I do hear a concern, and in a way we should consider climate change as part of the broad perspective. But my personal thinking is that the climate tracks are so numerous, so complicated, raising so much procedure questions, that we do need to keep them separate and to progress on procedures. And actually, and this is also another personal thinking, that was my point when I was talking about implementation. And this is linked to your question too. Creating every year new frameworks, new funds, new facilities also raise the issue of delays. It's a technical point of view, it's not a political one. The idea behind the debate that has been raised at COP26 about the funding arrangement and the loss and damages issues was so difficult to understand on the, I may say, the both sides of the table, is that on the one hand, vulnerable countries legitimately asking for finance were saying we need specific finance be directly attributed to loss and damage. And on the other side of the table, developed countries said, we took so long to build the finance track that are now functioning. For instance, for the idea of the Green Climate Fund and the effective first funding of the climate funds, I think there are 8 years in between. It's so long, so difficult to build a track that those funding partners were saying, we do not need to create a new track just because it's not serving the cause. It was not about creating new funding facilities, because so much members were eager to raise, for instance, the adaptation part of the climate fundings. And this is what has been adopted within the COP26 context, the doubling of adaptation funding from 2019 to 2025. And the issue was not there, was not about the adaptation part of it, but how to make this the most efficient, rapid, accessible possible. And I think this is where the debate still relies on. What is the best efficient track? It's an open question, but I think this is not about the volume of finance, but always about the procedures and how to make it accessible on the ground. Regarding the regional context you've been raising, and this is kind of linked the one has been said by my German colleague. Actually, it's also personal thinking. Climate COPs are considered to be the most important event of the year regarding climate change mitigation, adaptation, finance issues every year. There is a broad media coverage. There is a huge attention to it. And expectations are always very high, but the delivery is also every time upsetting. But the reason why it is so is that expectation are really too high regarding the ability of climate COPs. Climate COPs at this level are only creating standards and incentives. Decisions are hardly binding. Implementation can be in national and regional contexts. So that's why I do really think that we collectively would benefit from reducing the volume on climate COPs and to focus on concrete regional, local implementation and local programs. For instance, I'm going back to mitigation issues. There is a broad attention to mitigation outcome of COPs. So multilateral stage. But now we're considering within, for instance, the G7, possibility to focus our efforts on regional partnerships that are called just energy transition partnerships that could bear so much consequential results on the short term. The first JETP, as it's called now, so Just Energy Transition Partnership, has been signed in during COP26, but on the off side of the COP with South Africa, the most major emitting partner in the developing side of the table, if I may say so. So back in 2021. A new JETP has been signed with Indonesia. It's under consideration and maybe a short-term result with Senegal. And I do think this is illustrating the potential of regional partnerships. And that's why, and that's maybe where we should not focus our efforts, but focus our expectations. This is a personal view. And of course, the United Nations have no equivalent in setting a scene, in allowing especially small countries to have the same ability to talk in those negotiations as huge partners. And in a sense, also for NGOs, in the sense, this is the most inclusive international framework ever. So there is a huge importance in that. But regarding efficiency, regarding expectation, and regarding what we're working for, regional frameworks are the new COPs. But this is my personal view, and maybe I can understand this is not shared.
Thank you for that comment, Jordan. We're moving towards the close of this interactive dialogue. So I'd like to hear from two speakers. Dr. Janjua, you look at issues of national security, and more recently, you've also been looking at the linkages between climate change and human security. What do you think will be the destabilization impacts within the region and the country if the Paris Agreement targets are not met on time?
Thank you very much. See, the human security spans a very wide gamut. And we must distinguish between disaster risk reduction and climate risk reduction, because both are entirely different things. Like Aesop's fable, when the fox sees the shadow very long in the day, the planning is very ambitious. At the end of the day, it just contracts to just a fraction, and that's our reality. I was commanding an infantry brigade in Kashmir when the earthquake struck. So that was a massive catastrophe of, gargantuan proportions. For 6 months, the entire spotlight of the entire world was on that area. And a whole lot of planning was done. new building code, a new city was planned in Balakot, and the whole country was divided into zones, and new building zones and new building codes were initiated. But down the road, 20, 25 years, and you see that most of those commitments have not been met. So it's the question of our responsible response when we talk of adaptation, because as a developing country, we can do precious little by way of mitigation. It's 90% of the emitters are in the north. Here in the south, countries like Bangladesh, which are being swamped by ocean waters, we are confronted with floods of biblical proportions, heat waves, drought. We go into our Thar and Cholistan and Sutlej region, and you find that the fertile cropland is getting impacted because of these cyclical changes of climate change. So the specific answer to your question is that I see an alternation of, heat wave patterns which would impact our food security a lot. Already, this is a nation which has started resorting to import of a wheat, a commodity that we used to export as a bread basket to an entire subcontinent. So that's a visible and palpable impact. Floods are a GLOF phenomena in the north of our country. That's a very serious threat, and we don't know if those glaciers start melting fast as a consequence of climate change, and also some man-made activity which is contributing to this climate change. So that would be another disaster. The frequency and the intensity of the floods and the monsoon pattern changes, etc. This is all linked to the climate science, and definitely in all such discourses, it would be good to have a climate scientist who can just link the concrete science with whatever is happening on ground. Then, other than that, the impact of climate on our overall economic security is tremendous, because if your crops don't function as an agrarian country, and if the oceans, they start creeping up on your mangroves, inland sea intrusion, all this will spell disaster for the ecology of the coastal regions. So coastal regions are very, very vulnerable in Pakistan. So the habitats are threatened, the entire ecology is being threatened, and whole a wave of migration is taking place from one coastal region to another coastal region. So food insecurity, flood damages, intensity of GLOF phenomena, and glacial melting. So that poses a clear and present danger. It's an existential threat. And I think we need to be mindful of our nationally determined contributions as well. And if someone could educate me at least on how Pakistan is living up to its own nationally determined contributions to the climate cause of the world, and how the advanced countries in the West have lived up to those commitments. So thank you. That's my 2 cents.
Yes, I think for the NDCs, Mustafa, would you like to respond, and then Joseph, word to you before we go to.
Yeah, so thank you for raising these few very important issues in the context of our country, Pakistan. And I would like to add one more element into it. You rightly pointed out food security, energy, economic security, and all these questions around it, in fact, tilt towards our national security. I mean, all these issues. Water is another important issue for a country like Pakistan. We are right there on the water scarcity, frame of reference of a country being declared a water scarce country. So all these factors, in fact, are rightly said existential threat for us. And as far as our NDCs are concerned, and what's the difference between our NDCs and maybe the NDCs of many other countries, I would put it this way, that our NDCs probably are quite ambitious as far as the targets are concerned. I mean, we looked at 2030, and rightly so. If we say that this climate change is at our doorsteps, who has seen 2040 or 2050? So that's where Pakistan, while submitting its indices to COP26, actually raised this issue that other countries should also look at the near future rather than looking at the distant future. I mean, countries have submitted their indices for 2040, 50, even 60. So that's, if you ask me, in my personal opinion, that is totally, it's not practical, as a matter of fact. So our indices are quite ambitious. We have given a target of 50% GHG reduction by 2030, 15% from our voluntary sources, and 35% conditional upon provision of finance and technology and capacity. And also we have looked at the renewable element into our energy mix. That is also quite, I would say, ambitious, 60% by 2030. And also the introducing electric vehicles, again is quite an ambitious target given our current situation. So I would say that, as far as our indices are concerned, they are very stringent. And I would say, I mean, any kind of additional ask in terms of making our indices more stringent would be, I would say, not a good ask, at least to us. And I would put it this way, that other countries should in fact give more stringent indices and come up with the practical timeline. Giving timelines of 20, 40, and 50, once you have the 1.5-degree scenario, thrown out of the window, is not an option if the global community has to abide by the Paris Agreement.
Thank you. Jordan, your last comment, please, and then I will request Ambassador Shahid Kamal to make the concluding remarks.
Thank you. Regarding the Pakistan embassy, I've been very impressed by two things. The attention first, the attention that is given to coal. I understood that it was a 100% phase out of coal by 2030, which is quite, when I say it's impressive, it's because when we have G7 talks, it's not the case. Am I mistaken? Oh no.
Put it away.
I thought,
Let me correct you on
Please.
this. It is no new project on imported coal.
all right.
Yeah. We have put a moratorium on any project coming from from the imported element into it. So
Thank you for correcting me.
because we have a different situation in the country, as you would know, that we are still in the crisis situation, as far as we had a total blackout yesterday in the country but that was something different. But anyways, looking at our particular situation, it is we have put a moratorium on two projects that were totally put on hold. But we said that there'll be no new project on imported coal. And I would say that as far as COP26 is concerned, I mean, there was a lot of expectation that there will be some kind of a decision or an announcement on phasing out of coal, but it was sort of mellowed down by saying that not phasing out, rather phasing down, and any kind of subsidies to coal phase out needs to be taken out.
Thank you so much for correcting me. But in the end, what I was thinking is that, really, I do really think that we have G7 partners that are not even that range of ambition, which is quite concerning, but it's a reality. And the second point, please correct me if I'm wrong, is the interest into nature-based solutions regarding adaptation, which is also along my commitments regarding all the issues we have had around the table of the COPs on those. About the security issues and what you said, Professor, about the existential threats. A French philosopher that just passed away 3 months ago, he was called Bruno Latour, said that he was, in his terms, always very complicated, an architectonic question. All, as he calls it, all modes of existence are threatened by climate change. That's why we have to think about it politically, including security issues. And when I was speaking about the emerging tradition of climate diplomacy, is that in the diplomatic field, this is historically considered, I mean, during the last 30 years, as being a kind of diplomacy that is apart from security issues, apart from the traditionally conceived noble issues, which is not dealing about war, which is not dealing about direct security or economic stability. But we now can provide evidence that is dealing about those issues. There is a movement inside the United Nations Security Council to have climate change be considered as a security breach. And in that regard, France and its partner pushed an initiative to have some reports on that issue, on that side of the issue, a special envoy in it. Some other members declined the offer to work on those issues in that angle. But I'm sure within a few years, we'll be able to install it in the international community as a security, military, economically, development issue. And this was not a reality, let's say 10 years ago. And as a conclusion, I have to say that even if my experience is not that wide and not that long, I've participated in a lot of roundtables, but never with that diversity of factors, and never with that, let's say, precise way to tackle those issues. So I'm humbled by your invitation, and thank you very much. I'm very grateful for the talk we just had, and I hope we can keep in touch to, as you framed it, build that safe future together.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a pleasure indeed and an honor for us in collaboration with IRS to host you. Thank you, Dylan, for organizing the visit. It has been a very, very robust and interactive dialogue. So thank you to all the participants. Thank you, Mushtaba, for staying the whole time. You know, you took me by surprise. I thought the Ministry of Climate Change is always overburdened and he will come and make his special remarks and leave. So thank you very much for staying throughout and being part of this dialogue. I now invite Ambassador Shahid Kamal to please make the concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Asha. So much has been said about so many subjects. It's very difficult to conclude because this has been a very lively session. And I would like to start by expressing appreciation and thanks to Ambassador Nadeem Riaz for hosting this important event. Climate change we're discussing at the international level, but I think increasingly, as Rogan pointed out, that there is more regionalism now in managing the challenges of climate change. And I think within the context of South-South cooperation, perhaps there could be greater efforts
to integrate more of the discussion and maybe actions at the regional level. I'd also like to express thanks to Jourdain Vaillant for his presence here today and to speak to us about the climate negotiations, which are indeed now a very centerpiece of the international diplomacy. Also, I'd like to thank my friend and Additional Secretary Mujtaba for his presence here. And Ministry of Climate Change role is extremely important in whatever is happening on the climate front in our country. Let me, since this is about international climate negotiations, and it is being also in cooperation with the Embassy of France, say that for those who may not be aware, that Jean Cousteau, one of the great environmentalists and oceanographers, played a pioneering role in organizing the Rio Summit, the Earth Summit in 1992, which led to the creation of UNFCCC in 1994 and to the first conference in 1995 in Berlin. Also, I was present at the 2009 climate conference in Copenhagen, where it failed to reach a climate agreement. And then it took 6 years, and French diplomacy was very effective in putting together a climate agreement in Paris in 2015. There's a big mismatch between what the international community, the way the international community works in a multilateral forum, and what the scientists are saying today about what's happening to our planet. The first conference, Earth Conference, was way back more than 50 years ago in Stockholm in 1972. At that time, there was a paragraph about climate change and saying that the subject of climate change needs closer a look and analysis to see how it's impacting the Earth. And then 20 years later, we had the Earth Summit and then the CCCC. So it took almost more than 20 years from the first conference to have an organization that starts looking at this. And prior to that, we had the World Climate Conference in 1979. And then in 1990, there was a second World Climate Conference. So as you can see, we are not talking about what we are discussing today goes back a long time, and see the progress that has been made. It has been very difficult, but in the process, it has become much more complicated, more complex, and I would say also now much more unwieldy because there are too many subjects have come up. If you look at the conferences at the beginning, you will see that mitigation was the overriding factor. And then came adaptation. And now we had a very lively cross exchange on climate finance and agriculture and water and other things, technology, et cetera. So we are now in the midst of a real challenge in how to put this multilateral process. And if you, I think you had mentioned about the G77. The G77 has also evolved into at least half a dozen pressure groups within the G77. You have, and similarly, the other side, developed countries have their own groups. So it's a very complicated negotiating process. Everyone's trying to protect their own interests and so on. And I would say that just very quickly, I want to touch on climate finance. It's good news that we have this facility, but there are 2 meetings planned for this year for the Transitional Committee. And they're going to go into what was mentioned before to try and see after 12 years, if I'm not mistaken, 2010, the Standing Committee on Finance tried to the discussions on what is climate finance. And we still don't have 12 years later a consensus agreement on what constitutes climate finance. So this will be one of the very major challenging tasks before the transition. Then where will money come from? Who will pay? And which countries will benefit from it, etc. These are very knotty questions that will need to be handled. But the fact that it was a major breakthrough, there's no doubt about it. But again, there's a lot of hard work. And I say the time spans, whether whether we can wait for another 10 years for something else to happen and what will happen in terms of the what the IPCC is telling us. So excuse me. The second thing is on mitigation. The targets that have been set are not legally binding. These are voluntary targets. So there's no mechanism in which you can manage and control who is going to do what. But most of the mitigation obviously has come from the developed countries. And the targets have not been adequate. They should have done much more. And the impacts of not doing more is now impacting the developing world. So it has now created a dilemma at who is to do what. And I think this is a question that needs to be done more seriously, because at this last meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, there were oil and gas companies had big offices while the climate conference was going on, and many deals were struck to buy more oil and gas exploration, etc. The reality on the ground is such that because of the energy shortage, we have a conflict going on, and there's a shortage. So there has been lapse on that. There have been difficulties in getting the targets on track. And the developing countries, on the other hand, are facing serious problems of debt. I think it's about at least 70 to 80 countries are asking the international financial institutions for debt reduction or debt restructuring and so on. So it's come at a very, very difficult moment. A word on the Green Climate Fund, because I think this was set up, if I'm not mistaken, in 2010 at the Cancun conference, the high-level meeting, and the Green Climate Fund's replenishments have been a problem. But the other problem from our perspective sitting here is that only about 62 institutions from developing countries have been accredited by the Green Climate Fund. And out of that, only 5 or 6 or 7 have been able to really get the funding. Most of the funding has gone through the UNDP process or the World Bank process. So there's been no effort to build up capacity at the local level for them to be accredited by the fund. And if you look at the funding itself, we can say the developing country institutions probably had 2 to 3% funding directly to them. The rest were coming from the international organization. So this is again a major problem, and the amount was about, I don't know, in 2021, I don't know the latest, something, it was $1.2 billion, maybe, I don't, but very small in relation to what is required. So the fund, for all practical purposes, has not been able to come up to expectations in trying to address the financial difficulties facing the developing countries. The other, the issue is one of how do you manage the disaster situation. There was talk of the Sendai disaster risk 2015, also the SDGs. And 2015 was a critical year. Then we had the climate conference in December, earlier on the sustainable development goals and financing for development in 2015, as well as the Sendai in March 2015. And now we are 8 years later, and if you check, most of the targets are unmet because there are other problems have come in on the right in the middle. And the climatic, if you look at the IPCC reports, they're getting frightening by the hour. I mean, if you look at them, they have sort of now saying that, in fact, a few days back, I think there's been talk, the 16 so-called planetary boundaries, that we are now crossed half of those, almost. So, so how do we bring this about in terms of managing climate risks? In terms of what we are expecting, what is happening, and what the planet Earth is going through the transformation. So we have disruption on one side, and we have disintegration going on the other side. So the forces of disintegration and disruption are at the center of what's happening today. And we had the floods here a few months back, but we had floods earlier in 2010. So this is a pattern. If you see the monsoon pattern changing, we are going to have extreme weather conditions are coming our way. So how do we cope with that? Those are some of the questions that need to be answered. Another very important aspect challenges with regard to water, energy, agriculture, and so on. So again, the climate change process has not been very active on the technology front. I think at COP at Sharm el-Sheikh, there was a call to accelerate more on the technology front. So I hope something comes out of that. Another one on technology is the Santiago network that was set up in the loss and damage to help developing countries with technology. And it's still not there. The decision was that they should meet this year to set up an advisory board, who will host it, and who will be its members. I think those kinds of questions hopefully will be resolved this year. A very important breakthrough this year was within Africa, because it was in Egypt, to have the water. Water was given priority at the summit for the African region, African continent, which I think is very important because land is degrading in Africa at a very fast pace. And I'm doing a project in West Africa and the Sahel region, where drought and desertification have put millions of people at risk on the agriculture front, which is having its impact in the political and other sectors. So again, food security is a very important aspect. Traditionally, the climate negotiations have not been dealing with it, but now I think there is hopefully going to be a greater focus, because most of the livelihoods of people in developing countries depends on food and water. So again, coming to 2028 now, I think there's a very important list of things that need to be done. And the meetings will obviously focus once again on these subjects, which I said is difficult. But it was very good that we were able to have an open discussion at this forum. And I think one of the takeaways is that at the national levels, that we need to do more. We need to really mobilize our talent, our technologies, may take time. We don't know how much will come, in what way it will come. I think that is going to be one of the items that we need to look at. The second is also, I believe, at the regional level. I've been working recently on South-South cooperation, and there are many institutions in the South, in the global South, and the voice of the global South was evident at this conference at the last. The activities will scale up, and I think there'll be greater pressure. And this pressure worked in getting the loss and damage fund. And there was unprecedented, I think, demand coming from across all spectrums, not only within the global South, but also in other parts and in the other side of the negotiating table. So we are heading now into a very important and a very difficult process in the international climate negotiations. And the overarching is that we've just come out of the COVID pandemic, and there have been economic implications of that. We are now in kind of a geopolitics is working in some directions, which may or may not be feasible to reach those compromises. And third, the scientific community is bringing out those alerts. So we have a great job to do. And I think CSCCC has done a great job in trying to at least steer these discussions and bring up some very important points. And also the Regional Institute, I would say again, it's a good initiative to keep this going. And thank you to the Embassy of France for having an expert come all the way from Paris and share your thoughts with us. France is going to be hosting this conference later this year, and we hope it'll be successful. So thank you for inviting me to do these comments. There's a lot to say, but I think time is short. And reminded that of the phrase by Robert Frost that the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I promise this to keep and miles to go before I sleep. The climate subject can take us the whole day, and we can look at various aspects of it. But one thing, I mean, I've been myself, the first time I went there was in 2007. And I felt the pulse that this is going to be a big subject in the future. So fortunately, unfortunately, it has become so. And it is a very a challenging one because all nations are involved. And this is truly a planetary negotiations. We're discussing the planet and its well-being, how we can keep it healthy. I noticed there are some young people here, and I think the youth have a major role in when we look forward. If I'm not mistaken, at the Sharm el-Sheikh conference, there was an emphasis on youth. So it was good to see some young people here as well. And so thank you very much. And I'm sure you continue to have your successes in whatever you're doing, and wish you the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kamal. It was a very well-rounded conclusion to a fascinating day of discussions on international climate negotiations. So thank you very much. Once again, I would like to thank CSCCC and the Embassy of France for making this event possible. We have arranged lunch for you. It is in the reading room, so kindly join us for lunch. And thank you once again for all of you for attending today's event. Thank you. Thank you.